We will be continuing with the Milgram study. So, before the actual experiment began, Milgram made a few predictions about the results. So, he asked 100 of his Yale students about, think of it like as a hypothetical. So, if a hypothetical 100 Americans were going to take the study, what would the results be? And the most pessimistic of students said that 3%, that means only 3 of the 100 people, would follow through till the end, would go through the highest level of shocks. So majority of them said no one would follow through till the end. So clearly they had a lot of faith. So Milgram also asked a few of his colleagues informally what they thought, and the colleagues said that very few, if any, would go past the designation very strong shock, which was level 20, I believe. So let's see how these predictions compare with our results. We did note quite a few observations. Our observers noted that although many of the participants, even those who followed through, they did not do so without stress. So there were many nervous reactions we observed, like they were laughing nervously, like giggling, they were biting their lip a lot, digging their nails into their skin, they were sweating, and 3 people had an intense seizure, with one person having such an extreme seizure that we had to stop his experiment because it was a threat to his life. And I believe that person was a encyclopedia salesman who expressed that he was very upset and embarrassed by his behavior. After the trial ended, many of them showed obvious physical signs of relief, so they were like wiping their sweat off their brows, or they were just sighing with relief. So now we move on to the results. So we saw that out of the 40 participants, all of them continued to level 20, so the 300-volt shock. And then after that, participants slowly started removing themselves from the experiment. So 5 subjects left after 300 level, 4 more left after 315, and 2 more broke off at 330, and so on, and a few more broke off at 400. So, but 26 out of 40 continued all the way to the end, aka to the most strong shock level, the XXX designation. Now, the reason that we think that their termination point began from level 30 is level 20 is, if you remember, we discussed that after the 300-volt shock, the learner was trained to not respond. So he would pound at the wall, but then he would stop answering. So I guess our subjects assumed that he was in a lot of pain and hence decided that it was too much pain for him and they did not want to continue with the experiment. Obviously, these statistics are very, very different from the predictions that we discussed earlier, and we do have a few explanations for why that may be. So, and we also saw that even though many of the subjects continued till the end, they did not do so without the signs of extreme tension that we discussed over here. So they followed through, but they were clearly very upset about doing so, right? So we did do a few post-experimental checks and procedures. I keep calling this an experimental check-in procedure. However, keep in mind that again, it is not a lab experiment. It is simply a case study. So after each trial, we asked the participants to rate the last few shocks they had given the learner and how painful they think they were on a scale of 0 to 14, and the mean response or the average response we received was 13.42, which clearly shows that almost all of our participants believed that the shocks that they delivered, the ending shocks, were very painful. So again, this confirms your validity and your eco-validity because your participants are now believing that the shocks were very real, so their results are more accurate. And we also collected the modal response, so majority of them rated 14 on 14. So then we debriefed them and then we arranged a friendly reconciliation sort of situation with the learner to ensure that there were no harsh feelings between them and no lingering negative effects of the study, because that's our goal, to make the study more ethical. So we did discover a few things. We saw that the strength of obedience was significantly higher than what we had predicted or expected. And it shows us that a legitimate authority, such as an experimenter in his own laboratory at Yale University, can easily command someone's attention or someone's behavior and override their dispositional training. Dispositional training refers to your individual training or your individual instincts. So, your individual instinct would typically be to not hurt someone, right? But here we were easily able to override that individual training because of having a legitimate authority command. So, a second thing we discovered was that the high level of stress we saw was very unusual. So, even though participants followed readily, they did not do so without obvious discomfort. So, now we do have a few explanations for why the obedience levels were so high, and we'll go through them one by one. There's quite a few. So, first is the setting. The experiment was conducted at Yale University, and the name Yale carries a lot of significance and it's very imposing. So the participant might be intimidated by the university name, or they might think that because it's Yale, they know best. They're a prestigious university, so that might make them more obedient. Second is the payment factor. If you recall, the participants were paid $4.50 for their participation. However, that this point is partly nullified because they were paid this money at the beginning of the experiment and they were told that even if you terminate or leave, we will not take away the money. But this still might play a factor. Milgram did also he conducted many different versions of this experiment, but one particular one he conducted where he was not paying the participants anything, right? And the results were pretty similar to this one, so we can safely negate this factor. A third is fate or chance. So if you recall, our participants each picked out their name from a hat, right? And they thought that they became the teacher by coincidence, and the learner became the learner by coincidence. Even if we know that's not the case, at that time they did not know that, right? So it might mean that they are hoping that the learner will accept their situation, that they could have just as easily been in the learner's situation. So the learner should just accept their good fate, right? Because that's what happens in like army camps. So whenever there's a difficult situation and there's no, sorry, lieutenants to give position, so they all draw their names from a hat, and whoever draws the short end of the stick, they have to go deal with the intruders. Fourth is obligation of volunteering. If you recall, we used volunteer sampling, so the learner might feel the so the subject might feel more obligated to not leaving the experiment because they chose to come here. They chose to come here, they're less likely to leave, they feel more obligated to do so. Fifth is the merits of society point. Now, again, we gave them a fake aim. We told them this will help us understand more about learning and memory and punishment and so on. And so they might believe that the findings are going to be very legitimate, they're going to help society, and so they might think that the scientific gains to society are higher than, you know, the losses. So sixth is valid authority again. So the experimenter, he was very stern throughout. It was a very professional environment, and the authority was legitimate. And the more legitimate the authority, we know that the higher commanding power it has. Seventh is the learner volunteering. Now the experimenter also believed that the learner had volunteered just like him. So that means that he is expecting the learner to again accept his good fate. And if you recall, up until level 20, the learner did not stop answering. So he continued answering. So obviously, our subject would think that the learner is still part of the game or readily playing. Eight is again scientific gains, which is similar to the merits to society part. So these are the few characteristics of our experiment that might have influenced the obedience factor. Now, there were a few conflicts that our subjects were facing throughout the study, and let's talk about them. So, the first conflict, again, and the yellow parts are the individual conflicts and the red parts are the situational. So individual conflicts, we'll just talk about them a little as we did at the start of the study. Individual conflicts refer to inner feelings, right? What you want to do, or factors within you that cause you to make certain decisions. Situational are external factors without you that cause you to make certain decisions, right? So, the first conflict was our individual disposition to not want to hurt anyone versus our situational disposition of the experimenter's demands. So we didn't want to hurt anyone, obviously, but we also didn't want to disappoint the experimenter. And again, he kept asking us to do this thing. And to follow one or the other, we would have to make a public choice. So if we wanted to not hurt anyone, we would have to actively, publicly leave the area. And if we wanted to follow the experimenter, we would have to actively press the next switch for the shock. So no result was completely satisfactory. You cannot do one without disappointing or harming the other, right? So again, you would have to make a very public choice, and it was a very intense sort of conflict. The second conflict we felt was another one was the scientific merit of the study's finding versus we were able to feel the learner's pain. So again, after having received a sample shock, we knew we were causing the learner extreme pain, but we also knew that we were helping society. And so most of them, the people who followed through until level 30, they might have thought that the society's gain is more than the learner's pain, right? So one was more gainful than the other. The third, and perhaps a very generic sort of conflict, is the two deeply ingrained tendencies within us. Now, you might think these are both individual. However, the deeply ingrained tendency of obedience is usually a result of your situational circumstances, right? So our tendency to be very pro-social or very helpful, not hurt anyone, versus our tendency to be very obedient and be very respectful, right? So these are two behaviors that have been ingrained within us since childhood. These were warring factions and these were extremely conflicting pressures of our two psyches. So now that we have ended the study, we came to the conclusion that German soldiers were not different. So obedience was not different in German soldiers, and if the same pressures were applied to American soldiers, for example, they would also be willing to commit the same atrocities under obedience or under such pressures. So this was what Milgram initially set out to find, and we think he was pretty successful in doing so. Keep in mind that the study was pretty unethical, despite the debriefings or however best we tried to shield them. It was pretty unethical because we did not spare them from physical pain or we did not give them any sort of protection because they clearly had a lot of seizures, a lot of signs of stress and trauma, and they might carry it long term despite the debriefing we gave them. We used deception, so they might feel very embarrassed after learning that it was all fake, and they might not be willing to volunteer for a future study. Again, we did not give them a right to withdraw because if you remember the prods that we used, they were very insistent and forceful, and so they might sort of infringe on their right to withdraw. They might cause a lot of pressure on them. So this study was very notorious as well. This was one of Milgram's most notorious or infamous studies. After the study was conducted, he was actually touted as a very nefarious sort of professor, and his career went downhill. But this study did really help us understand behaviors of behaviors under pressure a lot. And if you want any applications for the study, you can always think about any organizational situation or something that is, for example, whistleblowing situation. So in a hospital, we now know how people will react to authority, right? So we can instill certain rules that will cause juniors to report on their senior doctors despite, because of the authority factor. So we can do that, and that might get more cases of harassment or misconduct out in the open. So that is it for this study. I hope you understood everything.